Neder, the vow, in biblical and Jewish rabbinic writings. And in particular, I'm interested in the difference and the gap between biblical Neder and early rabbinic Neder, which I see as quite distinct. Today I'm going to speak about the law-narrative relationships, mostly in the biblical example, though there are some rabbinic examples on the handout, and I might gesture to that a little bit. On the linguistic and ideational level, Judges 11 and Numbers 30 are in conversation. They're in conversation, I think, in the way that Robert Cover has described in Nomos and Narrative, where he writes, "No set of legal institutions or prescriptions exists apart from the narratives that locate it and give it meaning. For every constitution, there's an epic. For each decalogue, the scripture. Once understood in the context of the narratives that give it meaning, law becomes not merely a system of rules to be observed, but a world in which we live. Law becomes a world in which we live in the context of narratives that give that law meaning." I think for some of you this is already I don't even really need to read it out loud, but I'll continue quoting a little bit. And here he's using Nomos from Peter Berger's idea of Nomos, so it's not law narrowly, it's the world the human world that's created. A nomos is a present world constituted by a system of tension between reality and vision. So we think that the law kind of gives a way forward, or an arrow pointing toward from the real to the imagined to a more perfect vision. And narrative represents both this real world and the imagined, presumably better one. More than that, Cover says, narrative so integrates these domains of the real and imagined, what is and what might be. And he writes, narratives are models through which we study and experience transformations that result when a given simplified state of affairs is made to pass through the force field of a similarly simplified set of norms. And I think Judges 11 begins with a simplified state of affairs. To some extent, a man, a battle, a beloved daughter, an only daughter, passing through the force field of the vow. I'll just briefly define biblical vow and rabbinic vow, or at least my definition of how I'm thinking of them. Neder in the Hebrew Bible looks something like a deal, a verbal contract. I make a request of God and promise to do something if God fulfills my request. So, I could, as a biblical person, say, if Yahweh brings me safely from Zurich Airport to Ben Gurion and from there to the conference on time, I will give a talk in his honor. And here I am. Once the votary's request has been granted, she fulfills her vow by doing what she said she would do. So there's a very practical ramification to this structure of the neder. If God does not hear my vow, and that's the word that's used very consistently in the Bible, then, in other words, which means he does not fulfill my request, then, my flight doesn't arrive safely, or I'm stuck in traffic and I don't get here on time, I, the votary, am under no obligation to pay the vow. It's dissolved, that obligation. This is not, this idea, this reconstruction of the biblical vow has been talked about by Tony Cartledge and by Jacques Verliner-Blau, and I mostly agree with them. I talk elsewhere about thinking about it more as a gift relationship than as contractual, in the sense we normally think about it. Early rabbinic vows are quite different, and I'm speaking here of the Mishnah and Tosefta, though the rabbinic texts treat their nedarim, I believe, as if they are continuous with biblical neder. Rabbinic neder consists in denial, usually self-denial. So a classic example, I think I have a piece of it on the handout, later on in the handout, near the end of the English text. Nedarim, Mishnah Nedarim 1:4. Korban she'ochala, or konam. They have various words that they use it. So I name something as forbidden through the mechanisms of the temple sacrifice and the rules of how you treat a future sacrifice. A mechanism, of course, which no longer existed or no longer practiced, could be practiced at the time of the Mishnah's redaction. So the rabbis seem to be rewriting the vow, and I think they are rewriting it, but I could also substitute other words there. It's different for whatever reasons, to both, one, connect it to the temple cult, once there is no temple, in a closer way than it had been in biblical times, and also to sever it from dependence on the temple, because of course you couldn't actually give the sacrifice even if you wanted to and had vowed to. In this way, it's a kind of inverted memorial to the temple cult. So Neder now describes, that same word now describes a very different practice. And of course, one of the most salient characteristics of the conditionality is gone. The rabbinic vow is therefore not so much a vow as biblical citizens know it, that is a conditional promise, a tit for tat, as it is an oath, or a promise with a curse attached to it. Okay, and sometimes those sound like they're conditional. May God visit upon me tenfold. But that's a kind of appendix of conditionality. It's not I don't see that as a substantial conditionality. So some stories that are, there are a few stories that are in tension with the laws of Neder. And I'm going to talk about Judges 11 and Numbers 30 now. I see Numbers 30, which is on the first page here. It's also on the fifth page, I think, if you want to see the figures. I see it as a chiastic text with 4 cases, and those Roman numerals are my insertions, as are the Roman letters on the right side. And I see it as a chiastic, I see the chiastic structure as expressing a polemic. So the inner parts of the structure, the B's, and the outer parts, on the other hand, are distinct from each other, the A's and the B's, based on whether they're dynamic on the one hand or stable, or you could say normative on the other hand. So case 1 is a man, and that's the most stable case. A man makes a vow, and that's really the end of the story. He has to do as the words that exited his mouth. And you know, I translated it in this awkward way so that you could hear the resonances, so excuse that, the awkward translation. Case 2, a girl makes a vow, or a young woman, and that is not the end of the story. Her father may validate or silently accede to her vow. He may reject it and forbid her from keeping it. In the former situation, where he's somehow or other, lets it happen, the case has an afterlife. The girl may get married, and in moving to her husband's domain, she will then be taking that vow with her. The husband then has an opportunity to reject that vow that was made not in his house, but when she was still in her father's house. So this case starts out in contrast to case 1, I would say, and then goes even farther, right? Because it's not only that someone can, that it's not just, oh, well, whatever you said, that's what it is. It's that there's a second man who gets his own shot at nullifying or invalidating the same vow, that very same vow that she had made in her father's house. So the case is moving forward in time, and of course, also, in space, presumably moving to her husband's domain. Case 3, what about the widow or divorcee? She's not subject to any man's invalidation of her vow. As in case 1, right, but this is unique for a female, if she makes a vow, well, that kind of is the end of the story. Like case 2, this also has an afterlife, really it's a pre-life. It also is a case in motion. Here, the case takes the divorcee backwards in time to when she was a wife with a living husband, or she was a married woman living in her husband's house. So a vow that would have been made there and then, before she was widowed or divorced, that was not rejected by her husband, not invalidated or nullified, remains with her, and she is still bound by it. Case 4, the married woman, legally is redundant. This woman may also get divorced. Her husband could die in her lifetime. We already know that a husband can invalidate his wife's vow. So what is it telling here? And I think that the answer may be that it is not actually substantively different. It is simply literarily distinct. And what it does is set up a category in order to make a polemic. It presents a case that's potentially dynamic, right? See case 3 above, as if it were stable, frozen, normative. Just as a man's vow is irrevocable, once he utters it, he's responsible, assuming God does God's part. The 4th case presents the normative married woman in a similar way. Once she utters a vow, but of course there's a giant caveat. Once she utters a vow, and her husband says that it's okay, that's that. That's the end of the story. So note, therefore, the possibility for polemic here, again, for these 2 reasons. The married woman is set up as normative, meaning here as if that were a static category, when we know that it's not. You just told us that it's not, that her status is almost inherently impermanent and unstable. And second, that the divorcee is not made parallel to the case of the man, though legally, right, in the legal details, she is most parallel anyway. K'chol hayotze mipi v'aseh applies to her too. K'chol hayotze mipi ha'ta'aseh. she should do it. And she no longer has anyone who has the authority to nullify her neder. So, Judges 11 in conversation with Numbers 30. The story of Jephthah in Judges 11 is a story of a man rejected by his brothers, by his family, his clan, and they later returned to him, later in life they returned to him asking for a big favor, namely to lead them in battle against the Ammonites, and he agrees, and he leads them into battle, and in that, while fighting, on the battlefield, essentially, he vows a vow, and that's in verse 30. Jephthah vowed a vow, saying, "If you truly give the sons of Ammon in my hand, and that which exits the door of my house towards me, when I return in peace from the sons of Ammon shall be for Yahweh, and I will give it as a burnt offering." Notice the tit for tat, by the way. This is a classic, in as much as there is a formula, and there pretty much is. This fills it perfectly. When he returns home, it's his daughter rather than an animal acceptable for sacrifice who comes out to greet him. And he actually kind of places the problem at his daughter's feet and says, "What do I do?" Or almost kind of, "It's your fault. What do I do?" And she tells him that he must keep to his vow, and that she only asks for 2 months delay to go and wander in the mountains, and more my mated I and my companion. So in reading these two in relation to each other, this legal and narrative text, Judges 11, Numbers 30, I think we have to consider the laws contained in Numbers 30 as both preceding and following the story of Jephthah. So even though the holiness author to whom Numbers 30 is attributed, really much pretty, as we have it, lived well after Jay, who's responsible for most of the Jephthah story, some form of these laws that we find in Numbers 30 no doubt pre-exists Jay, possibly in a form closer to what we find in the Temple Scroll, where, by the way, the divorcee, if anything, if there is parallelism there, she's parallel to the man, and there is no separate category of the married woman. If we allow for this possibility, then Judges 11 would seem at first to evoke the case that appears first in chapter 30, of a man who makes a vow. And remember, there's nothing to be done. All that exits his mouth, he shall do. In this case, whatever exits his door is what he shall do it to. Here's a man who has to do what he has to say because God heard him. But Judges 11 may also invoke the second case, remember, of a young woman girl in her father's house who will get married, but who makes the vow in her father's house. Only here the roles are reversed. Jephthah lays the vow at his daughter's feet, as I said, in this you can see in verse 35, and his daughter seems almost to cite the law that we find in what I call case 1 in Numbers 30, with a little bit of a difference, right? There's actually a chiastic relationship here between that piece of the law as stated and as she says it. They reflect each other. In other words, the daughter is the guardian of the father's vows. She doesn't, of course, it would change the story completely if she did. She doesn't have the authority to actually nullify it, so it's a kind of, literary guardianship, soft guardianship, part of the plot, but it is then a plot that may implicitly question the authority that the laws that came to be expressed in Numbers 30, question the authority that those laws have given to her father. And Jay would all the while be supporting this in Judges 11 in the way that he actually also, through allusion, praises the daughter and criticizes Jephthah. So the narrative doesn't undo the law. On the contrary, it's clear that the law is followed rightly or wrongly, and Jephthah, properly or improperly, and Jephthah either kills his daughter or, sends her away to some kind of monastic life. Unlike the girl in the second case in Numbers 30, Jephthah's daughter doesn't move seamlessly or in any way from her father's domain to her husband's, and the text bothers to tell us that she did not know a man. Between the law and the narrative, there is a tension, and there's an arrow pointing perhaps to a better possibility, perhaps to a law that somehow accounts for this and that does not allow popular religious rights to reach these kind of, absurd and cruel potentialities. But now, Numbers 30, which in the form we have it, of course, is subsequent to Judges 11, may be reaffirming, there are all sorts of possibilities, obviously, but, maybe reaffirming Jephthah's action in Judges 11, actually. I guess it's possible to read it that way. It may be trying to take control of this popular religious initiation of a relationship with God, right? Because it's a give and take, by putting control explicitly in the hands of the father-husband dyad for the females. But in light of the chiastic structure and what I see as its polemic in Numbers 30, we might say that Numbers 30 is voicing a preference for just those limits on vow making as the married woman has. That's how we like it, that case that we presented to you as normative and complete and stable. Now, Cover sees the legal succession stories in the Bible, especially in the Pentateuch, as key to understanding a biblically constructed nomos. One must know the law in Deuteronomy 21, verses 15 to 17, the law of, it's a casuistic law of, the hated wife and the beloved wife and the hated wife, and not to prefer, not to go with your personal preference and in determining inheritance, right, but to follow the law. So one must know that law, and this is very important for Cover's interpretation, that renders the favoring of, Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau, Joseph over Reuben. It renders that illegal, et cetera, et cetera. And even, of Moses and Abel, and you could maybe even say Rachel over their older siblings, as at the very least awkward or problematic. So the Deuteronomic law gives that all of that theological meaning, you could say, right? You could spin out the forms of meaning that it gives it. Jephthah was the son of a prostitute, and he was disinherited. Illegally, it would seem. Maybe this is a kind of distorted Joseph story. But Jephthah, in any event, is the inversion of all the sons in the J stories of beloved women who take what is not theirs, right? He cedes what actually was his, or he allows it to be taken away from him. It's like the other side of that relationship. Having made a clumsy, foolish, and possibly, according to J, unnecessary vow, he nonetheless pays it up with his only child, once again following the law. And here I don't have good language for it, but I'm aiming for something like his vow was lawful, but it was not right, just, proper, okay, good. Judges 11 would then be dealing with or playing with what is lawful versus what is destined, what is ultimately right, but in the inverted way from how we're used to seeing it, in the illegal succession stories. Numbers 30 valorizes control even in this inherently difficult, if not impossible, arena, right? And it's difficult and impossible because it's doesn't happen in the temple. It doesn't happen even in a public sphere. It can happen in a family context, but it can even happen in a completely private sphere. It seems in the Bible that it's not clear whether the father or the husband always has a chance to hear it when it's happening, or the literary structure of the law points to the parallel, as I said, between the normative man and the married woman, right? With all the caveats of the way that doesn't work so well. By making the unobvious parallels there, built on an imaginary stability and finality of marriage for women, the law may be articulating a preference for administrative control over the votary to protect Jephthah from himself and his daughter, of course, also from his vows. That is, inasmuch as controls can be exercised in this private sphere, namely in the patriarch's review of his daughters and wives' vows, they are absolutely encouraged. I'm not saying they're absolutely encouraged, but that would be the idea. If there were a social structure in which to embed, if there had been, the way there is so clearly for women, there's such an easy social structure to control this, or with a caveat that it's a neder, so it happens in the private sphere. If there were such a social structure to embed a check on men's vows, this chiasmus hints the priests would utilize it. And I'll just add, I'll just add one thing then. A theme of Judges, of course, is Isha Yashar Beinav Ya'aseh. This was a time when one or man would do as he saw fit, as he saw Yashar. Someone else was talking about Yashar. So as he would see fit, or using the eyes. And you can see the parallel, you can hear the parallel perhaps with K'chol Hayotzeh Mipiv Yaseh, about the Neder, that all that exits his mouth, he shall do, mouth and eye. So Isha Rabbeinav may be both a wishful experiment of Yahweh and a statement of failure, right? So as failure, Isha Yashal, each man doing as he sees fit, calls for human legislation over other humans, right? Inserting something there between God and humans. As wishful experiment, though, it should, or maybe could have led to a society with just such mechanisms as Neder for direct and mutual relationships between God and humans that the Neder models.